I just started listening to Gary Taub's new book, Rethinking Diabetes. He deep dives into a lot of this. I told you offline, the numbers to me were staggering. They were way more than I thought. That since 2001, cases of type 1 diabetes have risen by 50%. That's a huge number, in my opinion. And what you're explaining explains that perfectly, right? Like we're allowing this lineage to continue, and so more and more people are going to get it. And it was interesting going back to those times as he's describing, like they knew that diet was a component, and they were trying to get people to eat more protein and more fat. But then when we developed insulin, all of a sudden people wanted the insulin and they wanted that treatments, and doctors didn't have to, mess with the kerfuffle of trying to change people's diets. It was just so much easier to give them the insulin and let them eat whatever they wanted. And so we kind of lost that knowledge and that information. And you wrote an entire chapter on type 1 diabetes, which is fascinating. It's towards the very end. Is it a bonus chapter? Is that how we should say it?
It is. I didn't even, because it's a hypothesis, I didn't even number it as a chapter because I wanted all the numbered chapters to be factual. Okay. And the insulin intolerance hypothesis isn't fact. Okay. It's my hypothesis. Do you want me to explain to the audience what it is?
Yes, absolutely. And you gave a great analogy of being in a room with a killer that I thought explained it really well. So maybe we could tie that in as well.
Sure. Okay. So the basic premise of the insulin intolerance hypothesis is that what brings on type 1, and by the way, that's what the insulin intolerance hypothesis deals with, is how to avoid the onset of type 1 diabetes, right? Because it's considered that we don't know how to stop the onset. If you have the predisposition, then you're probably going to get type 1. Okay, so the question is there a way to stop that? And so my insulin intolerance hypothesis speaks to that. And basically it says this: we all know what an autoimmune disease is, yes? So the body sees something as harmful and it overreacts to simplify the process. And that overreaction by the body causes detrimental impacts on the person's physiology. And they have some sort of illness or disease or unwellness, okay? So that's autoimmune. So many people have speculated that type 1 diabetes is an autoimmune response. But no one's addressed what exactly it is or talked about, well, okay, so we're calling it autoimmune. What is that pathway? What's the mechanism? Okay, so my belief is this. Our bodies know instinctively. I talk about the body's native intelligence absent what's up here, okay? In body science, I talk about that a little bit. High insulin is bad. High glucose is bad. Okay. Now, because the body knows that high glucose and high insulin are toxic, imagine if there is a particular person whose genetics and what triggers their genetic expression, okay, is that high insulin isn't just seen as an oh shit, okay? High insulin is seen as, oh my God, you're killing me, okay? Far more dramatic response than the other 99% of the people on the planet, right? Okay. That one person, their body freaks out and they have an autoimmune response, an autoimmune disease response. So what their body does is so hypersensitive to high insulin, it's so fearful of the high insulin that it goes and it attacks the cells in the pancreas that create insulin. That's its way of surviving. It perceives high insulin as such a threat that it says, we know how to stop this. And it goes after the cells in the pancreas that produce the insulin and kill them. Okay? The person ends up, they can't produce any more insulin or very, very limited supply of insulin. And prior to 1921, they die because blood glucose just continues to rise and there's no mechanism left in place to bring it down. Okay? So the question is, if there is this crazy over-the-top autoimmune response that kills the insulin-producing cells in the pancreas, and that is a disease of its own, is there a way, you've probably heard of epigenetics, the word, okay? I dislike using that word because people have read so much into it that doesn't belong within the confines of epigenetics. But for the limited purpose of this discussion, epigenetics would mean how we're triggering our genes to express various things that then have a cascade that lead to an outcome, okay? So if the body panics over insulin, how would we perhaps stop the body from ever having that panic attack? Okay? And we're not talking about this kind of panic attack. A physiological panic attack. How do we stop the body from doing that? Well, one suggestion might be we don't allow it to increase insulin from baseline. Okay. Now, insulin doesn't just bring blood glucose down. It does a couple of other things. So we can't eradicate insulin from the body, but we can keep it at baseline, which in type 1s, I've seen no evidence that insulin at baseline causes any adverse response. Okay. It's the increase in insulin that seems to trigger the onset of type 1, the repetitive increase in insulin. So my concept was this, in the analogy to which you're referring. I said, imagine you're locked in a room with a psychotic killer, and this psychotic killer is covered in knives, in sheaths, okay? And you got nothing, okay? He's got like 50 knives on his person, and you got nothing. And he's a known psychotic killer, okay? But you find out he's only triggered into becoming a psychotic killer when he hears loud music, which is analogous to high insulin, right? So there's a stereo in the room. And so, what's that expression? Fuck around and find out, right? Okay, so you go over and you turn the music on, and our psychotic killer is in the corner like this, doesn't react, okay? Turn up the volume on the music a little bit more. Doesn't react. Turn up the music a little bit more, and the psychotic killer goes, okay, I got my eye on you, right? So if you keep screwing around with the volume knob, increasing the volume, at some point you're going to trigger the psychosis. He's going to come out with these knives and he's going to kill you. And by the time you reach that moment, you can't undo that. You can't turn the volume back down and it's all good. Okay. So that is analogous to the high insulin. Okay. By the time you keep doing this again and again and again with the insulin, and the psychotic killer, which is the autoimmune response killing off the beta cells in the pancreas to produce the insulin, by the time that happens, you can't reverse it. You can't turn the volume down. You can't make it go away. You've screwed yourself. You're done because you kept turning the damn music up, which is analogous to high insulin. For these people who genetically, their bodies panic at high insulin. That's the hypothesis. Now, when we were offline chatting a bit ago, I mentioned that, presuming I am correct, the insulin intolerance hypothesis is factual, I will never live to see it, because type 1 diabetes almost always onsets at an earlier age. Most of it's in childhood. It used to be called childhood diabetes before it was called type 1. Yeah.
That's right.
It's very rare for the onset to occur after 35 or 40. Yeah, very rare. It's kind of like if you got there, it's like, whoo, I'm genetically predisposed, but it didn't happen. Okay. So for this to happen, we'd need to select a lot. First of all, families that had a predisposition to type 1 genetically. And then they would have to agree to keep their children in ketosis forever. Forever being measured, of course, by the time the child develops a will and a mind of its own. And then it would have to take over that responsibility for remaining in ketosis. Okay. So I don't know, I'm going to throw out some arbitrary numbers. If that study kicked off with 10,000 participants, by the time they all reached 35 or 40, you'd probably be left with several hundred that actually towed the line and stayed in ketosis every single day for all those years. But here's the thing. That's that ever shrinking cohort at the 35 or 40 year mark. If none of those who had stuck in ketosis their whole life, if none of them had developed type 1, I think that would be a very strong indicator that the insulin intolerance hypothesis is factual and that type 1 does not have to occur in anyone ever. Now, I'm not going to say 100% of the people who are predisposed could avoid it via ketosis. I'm not going to say 100%, but if you could reduce those you could reduce the onset in 99% of the people with a predisposition, you could make sure they didn't onset. How wonderful would that be? Of course.
Yeah.
Now, what are the odds that research is ever going to happen? Well, zero, I'm pretty sure.
Of course, yeah.
And of course, big pharma makes billions a year off of insulin. So why would they, sort of being crowdfunded? And of course, a study with that sort of longevity, 35, 40 years would be insanely expensive. And only the big players could fund something like that and keep track. And they have their fingers in the financial pie. They're the ones making billions, so it's never going to happen. But I would encourage people, if somebody has type 1 diabetes, they know their parents did or their grandparents, they've got type 1, they know it's a genetic lineage in their family, and they're going to have kids. You may be saving your child from type 1 by keeping that child in ketosis as long as the child is willing to stay in ketosis. Now,
That's
I know
right.
some parents are going to be, so what? We have insulin. Why would I care? What do you do about that?
Yeah.